How few years comprise the history of American literature is strikingly suggested by the fact that so much of it can be covered by the reminiscence of a single man of letters, a life beginning in the 20s had actual touching boyhood with Irving, and seized fresh from the press the romances of Cooper. And if the history of American literature be read more exclusively as the history of literary development essentially American, its years are still fewer. I perceive, says a foreign visitor in Austen's story of Joseph Natterstrom. This is a very young country, but a very old people. Some critics, indeed, have been so irritated by the spreading of the eagle in larger pretensions as to deprecate entirely the phrase American literature, our literature, they retort, has shown no national essential difference from the literature of the other peoples using the same language. How these carpers accommodate to their view Thoreau, for instance, is not clear, but waiving other claims, the case might almost be made out from the indigenous growth of one literary form. Our short story, at least, is definitely American. The significance of the short story as a new form of fiction appears on comparison of the staple product of tales before 1835 with the staple product thereafter. 1835 is the date of Peary's Berenice. Before it lies a period of experiment, of turning the accepted anecdotes, short romances, historical sketches, towards something vaguely felt after as more workmanlike. This is the period of precocious local magazines, and of that ornament of the marble-top tables of our grandmothers, the annual. Various in name and in color, the annual gift books are alike, externally in profusion of design and gilding, internally in serving up, as staples of their miscellany, poems and tales. Keepsakes they were called generically in England, France, and America. Their particular style might be garland or gem. The Atlantic Souvenir, earliest in this country, so throve during 7 years, 826 minus 1832, as to buy and unite with itself 1833 its chief rival, the Token. The utterly changed taste which smiles at these annuals, as at the clothes of their readers, obscures the fact that they were a medium, not only for the stories of writers forgotten long since, but also for the earlier work of Hawthorne. By 1835, the New England magazine had survived its infancy, and the Southern Literary Messenger was born with promise. Since then, since the realization of the definite form in Peary's Berenice, the short story has been explored and tested to its utmost capacity by almost every American prose writer of note, and by many without note, as the chief American form of fiction. The great purveyor has been the monthly magazine. Before 1835, then, is a period of experiment with tales. After 1835, a period of the manifold exercise of the short story. The tales of the former have much that is national in matter. The short stories of the latter show nationality also in form. Nationality, even provinciality, in subject matter has been too much in demand. The best modern literature knows best that it is heir of all the ages, and that its goal should be, not local peculiarity, but such humanity as passes place and time. The tales of the former have much that is national in matter. The short stories of the latter show nationality also in form. Therefore, we have heard too much, doubtless, of local color. At any rate, many purveyors of local color in fiction have given us documents rather than stories. Still, there was some justice in asking of America the things of America. If the critics who begged us to be American have not always seemed to know clearly what they meant, still, they may fairly be interpreted to mean in general something reasonable enough, namely, that we ought to catch from the breadth and diversity of our new country new inspirations. The world, then, was looking to us, in so far as it looked at all, for the impulse from untrodden and picturesque ways, for a direct transmission of Indians, cataracts, prairies, bayous, and sierras. Well and good, but according to our abilities, we were giving the world just that. Years before England decided that our only American writers in this sense were Whitman, Mark Twain, and Bret Harte. 70 years before the third of this perversely chosen group complacently informed the British public that he was a pioneer only in the sense of making the short story American in scenes and motives. American writers were exploring their country for fiction north and south, east and west, up and down its history. What we lacked was, not appreciation of our material, but skill in expressing it. Not inspiration, but art. We had to wait, not indeed for Bret Harte in the 6 O's, but for Peary in the 30 S. The material was known and felt, and again attempted. Nothing could expose more vividly the fallacy that new material makes new literature. We were at school for our short story, but we had long known what stories we had to tell. In that sense, American fiction has always been American, for by 1830 the preference of native subjects for tales, to say nothing of novels, is plainly marked. The example of Irving in this direction could not fail of followers. From their beginning, the early magazines and annuals essay in fiction the legends, the history, and even the local manners of the United States, in circles widening with the area of the country. Thus, the Atlantic Souvenir for 1829, furnishing forth in its short fictions an historical romance of medieval France, a moral tale in Oriental setting, a melodrama of the Pacific Islands, and a lively farce on the revolution in Peru, presented also, with occasional attempt at native scenery, the following: The Methodist Story, a moral situation of the anger of father and son. Naransauk, an historical tale of Baron Castine. The Catholic, weaving into King Philip's attack on Springfield the hopeless affection of a Catholic girl and a Protestant youth, the very field of Hawthorne, and a melodramatic emigrant's daughter. In the same year, 1829, James Hall, then fairly afloat on his vocation of law and his avocation of letters, compiled, indeed largely composed, the first Western Souvenir at Vandalia, Illinois. Its most significant tales are three of his own, set with more careful locality than most of the seaboard attempts in the frontier life along the Mississippi. The Indian Hetta and Pete Featherton present backwoodsmen of Illinois and Ohio. The French Village is definitely a genre study. Loose enough in plot, it has in detail a delicacy and local truth not unworthy the material of cable. That there was a definite tendency toward native themes is amply confirmed by the annuals of subsequent years before 1835. Besides Hawthorne's earlier pieces in the Token, there had appeared by 1831 studies of the Natchez and of the Minnesota Indians, the Maryland Romanists, Shays's Rebellion, the North River Dutch, and the Quakers, and the same tendency appears in the early magazines. The Western Monthly Review, adventurously put forth by Timothy Flint in Cincinnati, had among its few tales before 1831 an Irish Shawnee farce on the Big Miami. The Hermit of the Prairies, a romance of French Louisiana, a rather forcible study of Simon Girty and the attack on Bryan Station, and two local character sketches entitled Mike Shuck and Colonel Pluck. To extend the period of consideration is to record the strengthening of the tendency established by Irving and Cooper. The books of John Pendleton Kennedy are collections of local sketches. The Hermit of the Prairies, a romance of French Louisiana, a rather forcible study of Simon Girty and the attack on Bryan Station, and two local character sketches entitled Mike Shuck and Colonel Pluck. To extend the period of consideration is to record the strengthening of the tendency established by Irving and Cooper. The books of John Pendleton Kennedy are collections of local sketches. Mrs. Hale, praised for her fidelity to local truth, was supported in the same ambition by Mrs. Oilman. Mrs. Kirkland's sketches of Ernie, Michigan are as convincing as they are vivacious. Most of these studies emerge, if that can be said to emerge which is occasionally fished up by the antiquary, only by force of what we have been berated for lacking local inspiration. What were the forms of this evident endeavor to interpret American life in brief fictions? And more important, what was the form toward which they were groping? For this inquiry, the natural point of departure is the tales of Irving. Any reappreciation of Irving would now be officious. We know that classical serenity, alike of pathos and of humor, and we have heard often enough that he got his style of Addison. Indeed, no attentive reader of English literature could well fail to discern either Irving's schooling with the finest prose of the previous century with Goldsmith, for instance, as well as Addison, or the essential originality of his own prose. He is a pupil of the Spectator that is a momentous fact in the history of American literature. We know what it means in diction. What does it mean in form? That our first eminent short fictions were written by the pupil of a school of essayists vitally affected their structure. The matter of the Spectator suggested in England a certain type of novel. Its manner was not the manner to suggest in America the short story, even to an author whose head was full of the proper material. For though it may be hard to prove in the face of certain novels that an essay is one thing and a story another, it is obvious to any craftsman, a priori, that the way of the essay will not lead to the short story. And in fact, it did not lead to the short story. The tales of Irving need no praise. Composed in the manner typical of the short story, they might have been better or worse, but they are not so composed. It was not at random that Irving called his first collection of them 181920 the sketchbook. The Wife, for instance, is a short story plot. It is handled precisely in the method of the British essay, as an illustrative anecdote. So The Widow and Her Son, so the pride of the village, most evidently in its expository introduction. So, in essence of method, many of the others, and Rip Van Winkle. Here indeed is a difference, but not, as may at first appear, a significant difference. True, the descriptive beginning is modern rather than Addisonian. Romanticism had opened the eyes of the son of the classical, but how far the typical looseness of Romanticism is from the typical compactness of the short story may be seen in Irving's German tale of the Spectre Bridegroom, and it may be seen here. True again, the characterization, though often expository, is deliciously concrete, but it is not more so than the characterizations of Sir Roger de Coverley. Nor is Rip's conversation with his dog, for instance, in itself the way of the short story any more than Sir Roger's counting of heads in church. Unity of tone there is, unity clearer than in Irving's models, and therefore doubtless more conscious. But Irving did not go so far as to show his successors that the surer way to unity of tone is unity of narrative form. Still, less did he display the value of unity of form for itself. His stories do not culminate, as there is. It is not surprising, therefore, that Irving's influence, so far as it is discernible in subsequent short fictions, seems rather to have retarded than to have furthered the development toward distinct form. Our native sense of form appears in that the short story emerged 15 years after the sketchbook, but where we feel Irving, we feel a current from another source moving in another direction. The short descriptive sketches composing John Pendleton Kennedy's Swallow Barn 1832 have so slight a sequence, and sometimes so clear a capacity for self-consistent form, that it is easy to imagine them as separate short stories of local manners. But whether through Irving, or directly through the literary tradition of Virginia, they keep the way of the spectator. James Hall, who had been still nearer to the short story of local manners in his French Village 1829, was poaching on Irving's manner in his Village Musician 1831 with evident disintegration. In Hawthorne, who, of course, was nearest of all before Peary's genius for form seized and fixed the short story, it is difficult to be sure of the influence of Irving. True, Hawthorne's earlier historical tales, though they have far greater imaginative realization, are not essentially different in method from Irving's Philip of Poconoket, but it was quite as likely Hawthorne's natural bent toward the descriptive essay that made his earlier development in fiction tentative and vacillating as any counsel from the happy, leisurely form of the elder master. Be that as it may, Irving's influence in general, if not deterrent, seems at least not to have counted positively in the development of the short story. Rather, Irving left the writers for the annuals and abortive early magazines to feel after a form. What were the modes already accepted, and what were their several capacities for this shaping? The moral tale, of course, is obvious to anyone who has glanced over the literary diversions of his forebears, and this, equally of course, had often its unity of purpose. But since the message, instead of permeating the tale by suggestion, was commonly formulated in expository introduction or hortatory conclusion, it did not suffice to keep the whole in unity of form. Indeed, the moral tale was hardly a form. It might be mere applied anecdote. It might be the bare skeleton of a story, as likely material for a novel as for a short story. It was often shapeless romance, but two tendencies are fairly distinct. Negatively, there was a general avoidance, before Hawthorne, of allegory or symbolism. For a moral tale, allegory seems an obvious method, but it is a method of suggestion, and these tales, with a few exceptions, such as Austen's Peter Rugg, hardly rise above the method of formal propounding. Positively, there was a natural use of Oriental manner and setting, as in Austen's Joseph Natterstrom and Pauling's Ben Haddar. Another typical ingredient of the annual salad is the yarn or hoax story. The significance of this as American has been often urged, and indeed it spread with little seeding, and, as already spontaneous, has made a favorite diversion of the frontier. Its significance in form is that it absolutely demands an arrangement of incidents for suspense. The superiority of form, however, was associated, unfortunately, for any influence with triviality of matter. Again, the annuals are full of short historical sketches. Sometimes these are mere summary of facts or mere anecdote, to serve as explanatory text for the steel engravings then fashionable as embellishments. Sometimes they are humorous renderings of recent events. More commonly, they are painstaking studies. Delia Bacon's, for instance, or Charlotte Sedgwick's in the setting of American colonial and revolutionary history. Most commonly of all, whether native or foreign, modern or medieval, they are thoroughgoing romances, running often into swashbuckling and almost always into melodrama. the tendency to melodramatic variety, with the typical looseness of romanticism, then everywhere dominant in letters, held the historical sketches back from compactness, or even definiteness, of form. So clever a writer as Horde leaves many of his historical pieces with the ends loose, as mere sketches for novels. The theoretical difference between a novelette and a short story is thus practically evident throughout this phase of the annuals in lack of focus. Still, the studies of historical environment were more promising in themselves and also confirmed that attempt to realize the locality, as it were, of the present or the immediate past which emerges as genre or local color. The intention of Miss Sedgwick's reminiscence of federalism 1835 is the same as that of Miss Wilkins's stories of the same environment. Her Mary Dyer comes as near in form as Hawthorne's Gentle Boy to extracting the essence of Quakerdom. Where her studies fail is in that vital intensity which depends most of all on compression of place and time. Now, an easier way toward this was opened through the more descriptive sketch of local manners. To realize the genius of a place is a single aim. To keep the tale on the one spot is almost a necessity. To keep it within a brief time by focusing on one significant situation is a further counsel of unity, which, though it had not occurred to American writers often, could not be long delayed. Thus, before 1835, Albert Pike had so far focused his picturesque incidents of New Mexico as to burn an impression of that colored frontier life. And James Hall, in spite of the bungling, unnecessary time lapse, had so turned his French village 1829 as to give a single picture of French colonial manners. Hawthorne, indeed, had gone further. His affecting Wives of the Dead 1832 is brought within the compass of a single night. If the significance of this experiment was clear to Hawthorne, then he must have abandoned deliberately what Peary seized as vital. For he recurred to the method, but now and then. The trend of his work is quite different, but there is room to believe that the significance of the form escaped him. For as to literary method, as to form, Hawthorne seems not to see much farther than the forgotten writers whose tales stand beside his in the annuals. An obvious defect of these short fictions is in measure. The writers do not distinguish between what will make a good 30-page story and what will make a good 300-page story. They cannot gauge their material. Austen's Peter Rugg is too long for its best effect. It is definitely a short story plot. Many of the others are far too short for any clear effect. They are definitely not short story plots, but novel plots. They demand development of character or revolution of incidents. Aristotle's distinction between simple and complex plots underlies the difference between the two modern forms. Now even Hawthorne seems not quite aware of this difference. The conception of Roger Melvin's Burial demands more development of character than is possible within its 28 pages. The sense of artistic unity appears in the expiation at the scene of guilt, but the deficiency of form also appears in the long time lapse. Alice Dwan's Appeal 1835 is the hint of a tragedy, a conception not far below that of the Scarlet Letter. For lack of scope, the tragic import is obscured by trivial description. It cannot emerge from the awkward mechanism of a tale within a tale. It remains partial, not entire. Like Alice Duane, Ethan Brand is conceived as the culmination of a novel. To say that either might have taken form as a short story is not to belittle Hawthorne's art, but to indicate his preference of method. Ethan Brand achieves a picturesqueness more vivid than is usual in Hawthorne's shorter pieces. The action begins, as in Hawthorne, it does not often begin at once. The narrative skill appears in the delicate and thoroughly characteristic device of the little boy. But imagine the increase of purely narrative interest if Hawthorne had focused this tale as he focused The White Old Maid. And then imagine The White Old Maid itself composed without the superfluous lapse of time, like The Wives of the Dead. That Hawthorne seems not to have realized distinctly the proper scope of the short story, and further that he did not follow its typical mode when that mode seems most apt. Both these inferences are supported by the whole trend of his habit. For Hawthorne's genius was not bent in the direction of narrative form. Much of his characteristic work is rather descriptive. Sunday at Home, Sights from a Steeple, Main Street, The Village Uncle. To turn over the leaves of his collections is to be reminded how many of his short pieces are like these. Again, his habitual symbolism is handled quite unevenly, without narrative sureness. At its best it has a fine, permeating suggestiveness, as in The Ambitious Guest. At its worst, as in Fancy's Show Box, it is moral allegory hardly above the children's page of the religious weekly journal. Lying between these two extremes, a great bulk of his short fictions shows imperfect command of narrative adjustments. The delicate symbolism of David Swan is introduced, like 50 pieces in the annuals, whose authors were incapable of Hawthorne's fancy, by formal exposition of the meaning. The poetry of the snow image is crudely embodied, and has also to be expounded after the tale is done. The lovely morality of the great stone face has a form almost as for a sermon. The point for consideration is not the ultimate merit of Hawthorne's tales, but simply the tendency of their habit of form. For this view, it is important to remember also his bent toward essay. Description and essay, separately and together, sum up the character of much of his work that was evidently most spontaneous. Perhaps nothing that Hawthorne wrote is finer or more masterly than the introduction to the Scarlet Letter. For this one masterpiece, who would not give volumes of formally perfect short stories, yet if it is characteristic of his genius, and few would deny that it is, it suggests strongly why the development of a new form of narrative was not for him. This habit of mind explains why the Marble Faun, for all the beauty of its parts, fails to hold the impulse of its highly imaginative conception in singleness of artistic form. In his other long pieces Hawthorne did not so fail. The form of the novel he felt, and it gave him room for that discursiveness which is equally natural to him and delightful to his readers. But the form of the short story, though he achieved it now and again, as often in his early work as in his later, he seems not to have felt distinctly. And whether he felt it or not, his bent and preference were not to carry it forward.